real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
Northern Michigan Dogman and her son. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Everyone in Northern Michigan knows about the Dogman. Not the kind of creature you'd find in a storybook, mind you, but the real thing. Standing 7 feet tall, with a wolf's head perched on something like a man's body. I never believed the stories myself, not until last October, when I was hiking the remote trails west of Gaylord. I'd spent 20 years doing solo backcountry hikes, documenting wildlife from my nature blog. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine and decaying leaves, and the maples blazed red against a steel-gray sky threatening snow. Perfect conditions for spotting wildlife, I thought, though I had no idea what kind of wildlife I was about to encounter. I've been told the stories started back around 1887, when lumberjacks reported seeing a creature that walked upright like a man, but had the head of a massive wolf. The sightings never really stopped, clustering around the decade years. 1987, 1997, 2007. Ask any local about the Dogman and they'll tell you about a cousin or a friend who saw something strange in the woods. But these weren't the thoughts occupying my mind as I made my way along an unmarked trail that morning. I was more concerned with finding a good campsite before dark and maybe photographing some migrating birds. What caught my attention first was the silence. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that silence is never really silent. There's always the rustle of small animals, bird calls, wind in the trees, but this was silent. This was the kind of silence that feels like a held breath, like the forest itself was trying not to make a sound. And that's the moment when I saw them. In a small clearing about 50 yards ahead, partially obscured by a fallen oak, was something my brain initially refused to process. A creature that seemed to be a horrifying combination of a wolf and a human was sitting up on its haunches, cradling what looked like a smaller version of itself in its arms. The adult, the mother I realized with a jolt, was easily 7 feet tall even in its sitting position. Its fur was mottled gray-brown, darker around its distinctly canine head, which housed amber eyes that seemed too intelligent for any natural animal. But it was what the creature was doing that surprised me the most. With movements that were somehow both bestial and tender, she was grooming her young, using massive clawed hands to carefully pick through the pup's fur. The younger one, about the size of a medium-sized dog, had lighter, almost silvery fur and was squirming playfully. I stood frozen, my hand instinctively reaching for my camera before common sense stopped me. The mother's ears were constantly moving, rotating like radar dishes to catch any sound of threat. Every few moments, she would lift her head and scan the forest, her nostrils flaring. I knew that one wrong move, one snap of a twig, would alert her to my presence. The pup rolled onto its back, revealing a belly covered in softer-looking fur, and pawed at its mother's face with hands that seemed caught between paws and human fingers. The mother responded by nuzzling the pup's stomach, causing it to wiggle in apparent delight. The scene was so intimate, so startlingly maternal, that I felt like an intruder in the worst way. I watched them for a few minutes, and then my mind raced with questions. How many of them were there? Were these the only two? How had they remained hidden for so long? Was this why all those hikers had gone missing over the years? But beneath the questions was a growing sense of unease. If the mother caught my scent or spotted me, I had no doubt those maternal instincts would transform instantly into something deadly. A light breeze stirred the leaves around me, and I felt my heart stop as I realized it was blowing from behind me toward them. The mother's head snapped up, her ears pointed forward, and I knew my time was up. With movements that I prayed were slow enough to avoid detection, I began backing away, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to turn and to run. My heart was still pounding as I put distance between myself and those creatures. My slow backing away had eaten up precious daylight, and I needed to find a campsite fast. The deepening shadows seemed to hide watching eyes, and every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I found a suitable spot near a small stream, sheltered by a cluster of white pines. The location went against every rule of backcountry camping I had learned over the years. It was too close to a game trail, and the dense undergrowth limited visibility. But it was also naturally concealed, and right then, staying hidden felt more important than following standard camping protocols. My hands shook as I set up my tent, fumbling with familiar equipment that suddenly seemed awkward and foreign. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The rational part of my brain tried to calculate the creature's likely territory range, wondering if I'd gone far enough away. The irrational part of my mind remembered those intelligent amber eyes, and wondered if normal animal behavior patterns even applied in this case. As I worked, I tried to process what I had seen. The Dogman wasn't supposed to be real. It was supposed to be a campfire story, a local legend, something to attract tourists to small northern towns. But I couldn't deny what I had seen. Worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled onto something profound, something that was never meant to be discovered. The tender scene between mother and pup kept replaying in my mind, making me feel like a trespasser in a world I wasn't supposed to even know existed. When darkness fell that night, it felt really hard. I had skipped cooking dinner, opting instead for trail mix and beef jerky, anything to avoid food smells that might attract attention. The forest night was alive with its usual sounds, the hollow call of a great horned owl, the rustle of nocturnal creatures in the leaf litter, the soft whisper of wind through the pines. But now every sound carried new meaning and new threats. Around midnight, the normal forest chorus changed. The owl fell silent mid-call. Small rustling sounds ceased abruptly. That same unnatural silence I'd noticed earlier descended, but this time it felt closer, more immediate. I lay in my sleeping bag, every muscle tense, straining to hear through the thin nylon walls of my tent. And that's when I heard it. A soft padding sound, like heavy paws trying to move quietly through the forest debris. It was accompanied by smaller, lighter footfalls and occasional tiny whimpers that made my blood run cold. They weren't passing by. They were circling my campsite. The logical part of my brain insisted that if they meant me harm, they probably would have attacked already. The more primitive part of my brain remembered every detail of those massive claws and those powerful jaws. I reached for my flashlight, but I stopped myself. Would light drive them away, or might it provoke them? Would staying still make me seem less threatening, or would it make me seem like easy prey? A sudden snuffling sound came from just outside my tent, followed by what could only be described as a curious chirp. The pup, I realized. It must have followed my scent. A deeper rumbling sound followed, a warning growl from the mother that I felt more than heard, vibrating in my chest cavity. They were so close I could hear their breathing. I could almost feel their presence through the thin barrier of my tent. I lay perfectly still, barely daring to breathe, as the sounds continued. There was movement in the underbrush beyond my tent, the crack of branches under heavy weight. They were moving away from my campsite, but in which direction? The sounds faded into the distance, but sleep was impossible now. After what felt like hours of lying rigid in my sleeping bag, I made a decision that went against every survival instinct. I, for some reason, just had to know where they went. With trembling fingers, I untied the tent flap and I emerged into that moonlit forest. The nearly full moon cast deep shadows between the trees, but it provided enough light to move by. I followed the direction of the sounds, placing each foot carefully to minimize noise. The air had grown colder, and my breath formed small clouds that dissipated in the silver light. About 100 yards from my campsite, I found their tracks. Massive paw prints alongside smaller ones, pressed deep in the soft earth. The tracks led me to an ancient white pine that had fallen long ago. Time and decay had hollowed out its massive trunk, creating a natural shelter about 8 feet in diameter. As I approached, moving as silently as I could, I heard soft sounds coming from within. Gentle breathing, occasional whimpers, the quiet shifting of large bodies against wood and earth. I crept closer, my heart threatening to burst from my chest, until I could see into the hollow trunk. The sight stopped me cold, but not from fear this time. The mother dogman lay curled in a tight circle, her massive frame somehow fitted perfectly into the curved space of the hollow. Her fur appeared silver in the moonlight that filtered through gaps in the trunk, and her breathing was deep and regular. The pup was nestled against her belly, completely encircled by its mother's body, one of its 2 human hands clutching a fistful of her fur, even in sleep. The mother's tail had wrapped around the pup like a blanket, and occasionally it would twitch, causing the pup to snuggle closer. Every few moments, one or the other would make small sounds, tiny whimpers or gentle rumbles that spoke of complete contentment. The pup's face in sleep was less frightening than it had been in daylight, looking more like a regular wolf pup's, albeit larger. Its ears would occasionally flutter, perhaps chasing something in its dreams. The scene was so peaceful, so unexpectedly tender, that I found myself sinking to my knees to watch. Here were creatures that supposedly didn't exist, that violated everything we knew about natural history and evolution, sleeping as naturally as any other mother and child in the wild. The moonlight played across their fur, highlighting the rise and fall of their breathing, creating an almost magical tableau that seemed to exist outside of normal reality. I noticed other details too, how the mother's massive body was positioned to block the trunk's opening, protecting her pup from any threat that might approach. How the hollow had been carefully lined with dry leaves, and what looked like shed fur, creating a cozy nest. There were even a few small bones scattered around, evidence of recent meals brought back to their den. As I watched, the pup shifted in its sleep, letting out a tiny whine. The mother's ears twitched at the sound, and she lifted her head slightly, her nose working the air even in sleep. That was my cue to leave. I backed away as carefully as I had approached, storing every detail of the scene in my memory. Whatever these creatures were, however they had come to exist, they were far more than the monsters of campfire stories. They were a family surviving in the last wild places of Michigan, trying to remain hidden from the world of us humans. Dawn found me breaking camp with shaking hands, still processing what I'd witnessed during the night. The morning was crisp and clear, frost coating the fallen leaves in delicate patterns. I kept glancing at that hollow tree, visible through the trees from my campsite, but there was no sign of its occupants anymore. They must have left their shelter before first light. I needed to get back to civilization, to try to make sense of everything I'd seen. My pack felt unusually heavy as I shouldered it, weighted down perhaps by the secret knowledge that I now carried. Should I tell anyone? Would anyone even believe me? The photos I hadn't taken would have been worth a fortune. But somehow I felt grateful now that I hadn't violated that private moment between mother and pup. The forest felt different in the morning light, less threatening, more like the familiar woods I'd hiked through countless times before. Birds had resumed their normal activities, chickadees and nuthatches flitting through the branches above. A red squirrel scolded me from a nearby tree. Everything seemed almost disappointingly normal. But then, I heard it. A high-pitched yapping sound, somewhere between a wolf pup's bark and a dog. I froze mid-step, my heart leaping into my throat. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the crack of branches as something moved through the underbrush. Before I could decide whether to run or stay still, the Dogman Pup burst into view. In the morning light, it looked almost playful. Its silver-gray fur was tousled, leaves and twigs stuck in it from its run through the forest. Its tongue lolled out in what seemed like a grin, and its tail wagged with unmistakable excitement. Despite everything I knew about wild animals, despite the terror of the night before, I found myself smiling right back at him. "Well, hello there," I said softly, dropping into a crouch. The pup's ears perked forward at my voice, and it took a tentative step closer. Couldn't have been more than 30 feet away now, and I could see the curiosity in its amber eyes. Those eyes still held that unsettling intelligence, but in that pup's face it seemed more charming than threatening. Looking back, I can't believe what I did next. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, or perhaps the magical quality of the previous night's scene had affected my judgment, but as the pup took another cautious step forward, I held out my hand and said, "Wanna come say hi?" "It's okay, little one." The pup's tail wagged hard, and it bounced slightly on its paws, clearly torn between excitement and uncertainty. Then it took another step forward, and another, its nose working the air as it caught my scent. That's when I heard it. A deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The pup's ears flattened against its head, and it backed away quickly. Through the trees behind it, I caught glimpses of movement. Gray-brown fur, massive shoulders, teeth bared in a snarl that turned my blood to ice. The mother had arrived, and she was not happy. The transformation in the mother Dogman was terrifying to witness. Gone was any trace of the gentle creature I had watched caring for her pup. Her fur stood on end, making her massive frame appear even larger. Her lips pulled back to reveal teeth longer than my fingers, and a growl like rolling thunder emanated from deep in her chest. The pup whimpered and scampered behind her, all playfulness forgotten. I had precisely 1 second to make a decision, and my body made it for me. I ran. The sound that erupted behind me was unlike anything I had ever heard. Part wolf's howl, part woman's scream, but all rage. The crash of breaking branches and thud of heavy paws told me she was in pursuit, and she was fast. Very fast. My pack bounced against my back as I sprinted through the forest, my boots slipping on frost-covered leaves. I darted between trees, hoping their close-set trunks would slow down my pursuer. They didn't. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, accompanied by deep, huffing breaths that seemed to buzz in my skull. A low-hanging branch caught my shoulder, spinning me sideways. I recovered, but the momentary slowdown cost me precious distance. I could feel her presence now. I could smell her wild, musky scent. The rational part of my brain kept screaming that this was impossible. Nothing that large should be able to move so quickly through dense forest. I broke through a patch of sumac, thorns tearing at my clothes, and I found myself facing a steep ravine. Without slowing, I half ran and half slid down the incline, using saplings to control my descent. Behind me I heard the mother's claws scrabbling on the loose soil. The pup's anxious barks echoed from somewhere above. At the bottom of the ravine I splashed through a shallow creek and up the other side, my lungs burning. The cold morning air felt like knives in my chest. I risked a glance back and immediately regretted it. The mother Dogman was halfway down the ravine, her powerful limbs eating up the distance, those intelligent eyes now burning with primal fury. When our gazes met, she let out another bone-chilling howl. I crested the ravine's far side and spotted Salvation, a stand of massive maples growing so close together that their trunks formed a natural barrier. Beyond them I could see brighter light that suggested a clearing, maybe even a road. I dove between the trees, squeezing through gaps I hoped would be too small for my pursuer. The enraged roar behind me suggested that I had guessed right. I heard the sound of claws scraping bark, of powerful muscles straining against unyielding wood. But I didn't stop to look. I ran until the sounds of pursuit faded, until my legs trembled and my vision blurred, until I finally broke through the tree line onto an old logging road. Only then did I allow myself to collapse, gulping air into my burning lungs. When I could finally raise my head, the forest behind me was silent. Through the trees I caught a final glimpse of movement. The mother's massive form, still visible due to her height, shepherding her pup away from the road, away from human contact, back into the deep woods, where their kind had managed to stay hidden for so long.
S.A. Rose, the Rose That Knows. Please join me in thanking channel member S.A. Rose for making this episode possible. As a $7 channel member, S.A. Rose gets to see our weekly secret uncensored episodes. For more information about how you can help this channel stay online, here's our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank?
Thanks, Biggie, and thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.